we practice as Mahayana Buddhists, the Bodhisattvas, the different Buddhas. All of these are human ways to anthropomorphize abstract concepts. So you have the Bodhisattvas who embody particular qualities, like we have a Bodhisattva of compassion, and we have a Bodhisattva of wisdom, and a Bodhisattva of effort. And the Bodhisattvas are these human forms that represent those qualities, because it's easier to depict in our mind a person performing acts of compassion over just the concept of compassion. How do you picture that in your mind, just compassion? So same with Buddhas. We have Medicine Buddha, and there are colors and objects associated with the Medicine Buddha, just as we have with Amitabha Buddha. And these all are ways for human minds to conceptualize these things. So the Trikaya is another way of depicting in our mind these abstract qualities. The three Trikaya, it's tree like three. So it's the Dharmakaya, the Sambhogakaya, and the Nirmanakaya. The Dharmakaya is just like Dharma with K-A-Y-A at the end. And that is considered the essence of the Buddha. That's the source of awakening and joy, the Dharmakaya. The Sambhogakaya, which is Sambhogakaya, Sambhogakaya, is the enjoyment body of the Buddha. It's also called the body of bliss. And then we have the Nirmanakaya, which is Nirmanakaya, Nirmanakaya. That is called the transformation body, or the historical embodiment of the Buddha. So we would look at Siddhartha Gautama, who we know as Shakyamuni Buddha, the historical Buddha of our world, is Nirmanakaya. There must be a dog outside. They only ever bark like that when there's a dog outside. When the Buddha was dying, and the different disciples, and Ananda in particular, were beginning to grieve his passing, I believe it was Ananda who said, well, once you die, who is going to teach us the Dharma? And the Shakyamuni said that this body will pass on, but the Dharma will still be taught through the nature of the world around us. So just like when we're talking about in the sutra, the Amitabha Sutra, the whole world, the physical world, conveys the Dharma. And so the Buddha began the very first teaching of the Dharmakaya, which was that Buddha nature, law and order, the truth of the Dharma is unlimited by space and time. So it can manifest anywhere, anytime, in any form. And so the Buddha was saying that, the body this body that carried the teachings may pass away, but the Dharma will still be taught. Then after the Mahayana Buddhism came around, they decided they needed some way to explain how people would receive visions or while meditation experience the, maybe call like the voice of the Buddha or an image of the Buddha appearing to them. And this is where the Sambhogakaya was created to explain that that's the Buddhas that we meet through our meditation and visions, the Sambhogakaya. I'm not sure when the Nirmanakaya kind of developed, but it would have been after the time of the Buddha's passing. In Pure Land Buddhism, there's a little bit of a different kind of breakdown of the application of the three Trikayas. For Pure Land Buddhists, the Nirmanakaya is the physical manifestation of the Buddha. So that was Shakyamuni. Shakyamuni was the Nirmanakaya. The Sambhogakaya are the forms that the bodhisattvas take when they become Buddhas. So the bodhisattva makes all these vows, and then at the time that they've fulfilled all their vows and they have become Buddha, they inherit the body, which is the Sambhogakaya. So that's Amitabha Buddha is Sambhogakaya. Vajrasattva and Manjushri are also considered Sambhogakayas because they are bodhisattvas who acquire through their vows a Buddha's body. They awaken.
That was the body of bliss?
Yes. Yeah, the enjoyment body. So it's sort of like, I put all this effort, I fulfilled all my vows. The reward is that I get this body, this Buddha body. And so that's the body of bliss. It's not like, the body of bliss in the sense of sensual desires and fulfillments and things like that. It's the body of bliss that is the joy of realizing awakening and nirvana. Then,
so I'm sorry. Can I just ask a question? Is Sambhogakaya? So that is manifested by people. So it's always going to be about a person. I guess I'm a little bit confused.
Well, the early introduction of the Sambhogakaya for Mahayanas was that when you're meditating and you have a vision, or maybe you hear the Buddha speaking to you, or an image appears before you of like Avalokiteshvara or Shakyamuni Buddha or Amitabha Buddha, that image, that voice, that vision would be Sambhogakaya.
But does that just mean that it's really your voice in your head telling you what they are transmitting to you? I mean, that you're not having a real vision like you saw the Virgin Mary or something.
I don't know, because I'm not in other people's heads. Some people may have visions of, again, it goes back to the way that the sutra is taught, right? With Pure Land Buddhism, the emphasis is on this outside power. If you direct yourself to it, it will guide you to awakening, or to, in this case, Sukhavati. But we also know, the Buddha taught, that there is no outside or inside. They are one and the same. So is the vision or the voice that you hear, is that outside or inside? It doesn't really matter because they are the same thing. Now, the challenge for all of us in our own cultivation of practice is to make sure that the voice that we hear is not our ego either. And so practice, the practice is what's going to help us to understand the difference. And if you meet anybody who's an experienced, that kind of outside voice coming to you, the authentic ones usually are very, they stand out. It's almost always, when you question it, is usually probably your own conscious communicating with you, or ego. But this was a way for the Mahayanas to explain this experience, because this would be after the Buddha had passed away and had been gone for a long time. How, if someone, is practicing and does have some vision or hear the voice of the Buddha talking, they didn't have a context to say, oh, well, I heard his talk last week and now I'm just kind of remembering it. He had been dead for thousands of years. So this was their way of explaining what that was when people would have an experience like that. Then for the Pure Land Buddhists, the Dharmakaya is the embodiment of truth itself. So it is the spiritual form of the transcendence of form and, or I guess we'd say, time and space. So when we chant on Sunday to Vairocana Buddha, the embodiment of Shunyata, we are chanting to the Dharmakaya, because Shunyata is both and, right? It's the outside, it's the inside, but neither can exist independently of the other. So they're both and. That's what Shunyata teaches us. So we chant to Vairocana again as a visual form, symbolic form of this concept of Shunyata, which is difficult to conceive of by itself. I think that Venerable Wanji was pretty brilliant in his use of those diagrams that you see, where if you look at it one way, it looks like a candlestick, and if you look at it another way, it looks like two faces. And you need the other in order to see the other one, right? You can't, to see the candlesticks, you need the faces, but you need to not see the faces to see the candlestick. And if you want to see the faces, you have to not see the candlestick, but the candlestick is there to make the faces. So you need both and that's really what Shunyata is. So Vairocana is just a depiction of that kind of abstract concept.
What word are you using? Are you saying and? You need both.
And. A-N.
And D. Okay.
Yes, you all need to go get an ant and keep that with you. Put it on the altar.
Can I just run this by you so that I'm sure that I'm understanding properly? So Dharmakaya is the body of teachings, basically, right?
Yeah.
And
so
then
Dharma, it's the Dharma made in whatever form it appears and is needed to appear.
So it's that
Convey the
you is that you learn the Dharma from watching a plant, from watching birds, from listening to rivers, that idea.
to a person stopping you in the street and saying
Right. And then the Sambhogakaya
Mhm.
is the unexplainable, like someone gets a teaching or hears a voice or has a revelation of some kind that obviously comes from Buddhism or Buddha. Is that right?
Well, all of these are the Buddha, but they're just different
Okay.
bodies of the Buddha. Yeah.
All right. But the Sambhogakaya is specifically the visions that people have or the voices they hear.
For the general Mahayanas, yes, but
Okay.
for the Pure Land, it was the body of the Buddha that the Bodhisattvas achieved or attained.
Okay.
So
Because
it's Amitabha,
they
Narayana.
they hold within their beings the embodiment of the teachings. Is that?
No, it's for the Pure Land Buddhists, it was the reward they got for achieving their vows.
Okay.
And then once they achieved that body, then they could also appear as all the other Buddha forms, Buddha bodies, the Nirmanakaya and the Dharmakaya.
Okay. So is Nirmanakaya the physical manifestate, like Shakyamuni Buddha?
Yeah,
He
for our
was
world, that was the physical manifestation of the Buddha. On some other world, the Buddhist cosmology is that every world has a Buddha, a historical Buddha at some point. So some other world will have a Buddha that will be there. That world's Nirmanakaya, and some other world will have a Buddha that will be that world's Nirmanakaya. But what makes it all very interesting is that if there's one Buddha, they're all the Buddhas. So Shakyamuni Buddha here would also be the Buddha over there, or the Buddha over there, once they achieve being a Buddha. So any of the bodhisattvas who realized all their vows and became Buddha, now are also all the other Buddhas. All of this, what this all was, is a way to understand the reach and different ways of encountering the truth. So that way, if we're meditating and you do have some vision and it is a transformative experience, you can understand that as a form of the Buddha facilitating your awakening. And if you are walking down the street and you see a leaf blow into the road and all of a sudden, bang, you're awake, that was the Buddha teaching the Dharma in the form of Dharmakaya, meaning that the body of the Buddha isn't there, but the Dharma is being taught anyway. Which was kind of the whole emphasis of what Sukhavati is, right? Everything in Sukhavati teaches the Dharma. Sukhavati is Dharmakaya. But it also has Sambhogakaya because Amitabha is there, and it has Nirmanakaya because if there's one Buddha there, there is all Buddhas there. So now to just really, get you confused, there's a Zen approach to the three Trikayas. So for the Zen approach to the Trikaya, we don't look at these as absolutes. We look at these as more of conceptual tools. So the Dharmakaya is for the Zen Buddhists. This would be the one that would be most accessible to us because the Buddha taught it before he died. So we think of this as a legitimate teaching. And it was his way of saying that the source of awakening, the embodiment of the Dharma, is inherent in nature. It appears in the teachers who teach the Dharma, and it is considered the Buddha that exists always. And so in Zen, Dharmakaya, Vairochana Buddha is Dharmakaya. It is we would say, like the ontological Buddha, the Buddha spirit or the Buddha soul, the true Buddha, again, Shunyata. So Zen would look at when we talk about your practice awakening the bodhisattva in you, a Zen understanding would be that is the light of Dharmakaya shining through you. That we in ourselves embody Dharmakaya when we are embodying the teachings of the Dharma. For the Sambodhakaya in Zen, this would be, again, it is the reward of the Buddha body for the practice, for doing the practice and it leading you to attain this embodiment of joy and peace. And for Zen, that would mean that it would be perceiving or touching the non-differentiated light of the bodhisattva in the present moment. So non-differentiation, meaning no outside, inside, no opposites. Everything is one. And then for Nirmanakaya, for the Zen Buddhist, that's the historical Buddha that physically manifests the Dharmakaya. And for ourselves, we would say that this is the non-discriminating body of the Bodhisattva within us in the present moment. And so that would be basically, when we forget or when we drop the illusion of the false self.
Drop illusion of what? False self?
False self. The anatman.
False self.
Yeah. Because the Buddha taught that, the three seals of the Dharma is I'm trying to remember the other two. Oh, impermanence. Anatman. Why am I thinking? We chant that on our
Self-interconnection?
Huh?
Would it be self, a self and then interconnection? The interconnectedness?
No, it's the three things that are
I'm confused.
the truth of the Dharma. If we want to know if the Dharma is true, it possesses these three things. It is the impermanence, non-self or anatman, and nirvana. Yeah. So the three things being that everything is impermanent. There is no separate self or a separate independent existence And when those two are realized, I'm paraphrasing really badly, but you realize the extinction of desire, which is nirvana. The quenching of the fuels of desire is probably more accurate for what nirvana is. So those three things are what marks the this is how we would determine these are the teachings of the Buddha, because all of his teachings supported those three truths. So that's why we call them the Dharma seals. Because it's sort of like you write a paper and then you would stamp those on the paper saying they are all contained in that. You know, like when you see Chinese people with their chops signing the documents, identifying. So now let's move to the sutra. So I think we left off on, wait a minute here. Can you see the text?
Yes.
It's not blocked by anything?
No.
Oh, okay.
You're in, no.
Okay. Because I got all your pictures there and I wasn't sure if you could see that or not. So who would like to read the 7th verse there?
I can.
Okay.
If there are good men or good women who hear of Amitabha Buddha and recite his name single-mindedly and without confusion for 1 day or 2 days or 3 days or 4 days or 5 days or 6 days or 7 days, then when these people are about to die, Amitabha Buddha and all sages who are with him will appear before them. When these people die, their minds will not fall into delusion, and they will attain rebirth in Amitabha Buddha's land of ultimate bliss.
Okay, so what in Pure Land Buddhism, just as a review, the practice is in reciting the Buddha's name. We call that the recollection of the Buddha, as often as possible, and ideally as you are dying. And if you are able to do that, then you will be transported to Sukhavati, and then you will be able to cultivate your practice with no hindrance or obstruction. That's the traditional Pure Land approach. If we wanted to explore this in a more contemporary way, in the way that we would be practicing it more likely, what we see is that if through the recollection of the Buddha's name, we are cultivating, because it says right there, we are single-mindedly, which means one-point mind, and without confusion. So if you achieve one-point mind, you are not, you have no confusion in your mind. Everything is clear. Whether it's 1 day, 2 days, 3 days, or 4 days, 5 days, 6 days, or 7 days, doesn't matter. If you have 1-point concentration, then you are cultivating the Buddha path. So for us, this is a technique of practice that helps us to attain that 1-point mind, which is the mind of mindfulness. It's the mind of concentration. It's the mind of insight. And one of the benefits about the practice in this form is that anybody can do it at any time. They could do it when they have lots of energy. They could do it when they have very little energy. They can do it while they're alive, and they can do it while they're dying. So it was also a way of making practice egalitarian. That you don't have to be, a person who has reached the 8th level of meditation. There's like the 8 levels of meditation, and it's all like this different type of awareness and consciousness that you attain. None of that stuff matters. All that matters is that you would chant and attain one point mind, which is what any of us who meditates is working toward. And when we practice, if we practice with that sincerity, then our practice itself grows and develops. And this is what connects us to the qualities of the Buddha, which is that we do not fall into delusion. And when we attain rebirth in this moment, because we have the ability to be reborn every moment, then we attain the land of ultimate bliss, which is right here, right now. That's the modern or contemporary approach of Pure Land Buddhism. Thich Nhat Hanh, when describing the sutra, reminds us that this is also meant to be, this verse right here is meant to be encouragement and a way of connecting to that unconditional love that Amitabha Buddha represents. Because remember, he is the Buddha of ultimate life and light. And that, on top of being a Buddha, means that he is the embodiment of love. And sometimes we even hear Amitabha being the Buddha of infinite light and love. So this paragraph is also meant to be read as a wonderful good news, because we have we say unlimited light, and the idea that it requires no fuel, it burns forever, and it reaches everywhere. And this Amitabha Buddha has created this world just for us to practice and perfect ourselves, and under his support and guidance, which, of course, if we take that as a metaphor, it's about the unconditional love that we can connect to at any moment, any time, with anything and anyone, because it is our intrinsic nature. It's all of the delusions and the layers of ignorance and desires and all those kind of things that have obscured or obstructed us from realizing that innate nature within us, that Buddha that we all possess. I told my 3-year-old nephew, because I've got this Buddhas, and who is this guy up here? And I said, that's the Buddha, and we all have Buddha inside us. So now he says all the time, does that chair have Buddha? Does that sign have Buddha? Does that tree have Buddha? Like we were driving around the other day, and he kept pointing. He goes, because of course he's 3, and some of you who were there on Sunday will not be surprised by this, but then he says, does the toilet have Buddha? And I said, yes, everything has Buddha. And then he says, does Malcolm have Buddha? And I said, of course. And then he just thought that was the awesomest thing. You know, Malcolm has. So this is what, you know, Amitabha is bestowing upon us, is this great gift of this this place that we can wake up to in order to help us. All we have to do is just recite the name with single mind or 1-point concentration. In Zen, you know, this is the part where, you know, Western people, a lot of the younger Asian people who have become more westernized get stuck on, because there's this thing about, you know, it's just, this is superstitious because, you know, they're talking about chanting this name and then we're going to get transported to this, you know, magical place with all these crystals and gemstones and everything. Everybody's like, it's like the Stepford Wives, right? Everybody's happy and perfect, and most people will be like, yeah, that doesn't sound like a place I want to go to. And what we understand of our practice is that what we're really meant to do through any form of the practice of the Dharma is to cultivate wholesome seeds. Our physical life here, you know, wherever and whenever we're born, we already, from the moment we appear in the world, we are already carrying all these different kinds of seeds. In Buddhist terminology, we call them bija, which means seed. And they're already in us because of who our parents were, where we are born, you know, what race we are, what gender we are, even, you know, the economic level of our parents, and all these different things determine, from the moment we're born, a whole bunch of seeds. Then as we continue to grow and learn in the world, we collect more seeds. Every experience we have creates a seed, and all those sit in our, what we call, storehouse consciousness. And whenever we encounter something later on in our life, how we engage in that situation can determine what seeds get nourished and wake up. So we may have seeds of greed and seeds of happiness and seeds of anger and seeds of indifference. All these different kinds of seeds are all kind of sitting back there in our subconscious. And one encounter with a person might have just the right nutrients to awaken a seed of greed, or a seed of happiness, or a seed of indifference, or seed of anger. And the more we engage in the reactions that those seeds wake up in us, the more we feed them. So our practice, as taught by the Buddha, is to help us cultivate the seeds that are beneficial, and weed out the seeds that are harmful, or might say unwholesome versus wholesome. So we don't want to cultivate seeds of anger or greed. We want to cultivate more seeds of equanimity and joy and charity and those kind of things. So any practice that the Buddha taught was what we call skillful means toward cultivating wholesome seeds. What this paragraph says is that we can cultivate those seeds, and even if we die, while cultivating those seeds, they will still help us. But we don't have to wait till we die to benefit from cultivating those wholesome seeds. If we practice every day, and if we learn to live fully in the moment, we cultivate those wholesome energies, those nutrients that feed the wholesome seeds moment to moment through our lives. And if we continue to do that as much as we can, then it will help to direct where our consciousness goes after we die. That's really what this is saying. If we want to believe that our consciousness is going to wake up in another world, like as in the other Pure Land Sutra talks about, we arrive in Sukhavati in a lotus flower, because our practice has been growing this lotus flower, and then there's a bud, and then the moment we arrive in Sukhavati, it's like a flower opens, and bing, there we are on top of the lotus flower. Maybe that happens. If we cultivate the seeds in our lives, then if it does work that way, then we've assured it works that way. If it doesn't, it still can't be a bad idea, because what we leave behind leaves seeds behind. And if we leave behind more wholesome seeds than the unwholesome seeds, then we're contributing to the future living beings in the world. So that's kind of our motivation for this. It doesn't have to be only for after we die. I just want to review briefly again the 1-point concentration, because this is also the part that Pure Land and Zen are pretty much on the same page here. If we chant or we practice meditation with a full open, an open mind and open heart, and again, when I talk about mind, I'm talking about the higher brain, the transcendent mind, we would call bodhicitta, because it's the heart mind. Then we are cultivating a practice of 1-point meditation, 1-point mind. Our heart is on the recollection of the Buddha. The mind is on the practice. So just like when we're chanting, our mind is concentrated on the chanting. Our heart is trying to open up to the sound of the chanting. The sound of the chanting is what connects us to all of those who have chanted for thousands of years, all of those who are chanting today, and all of those who are chanting in the future. If we are open in that way, then we are opening ourselves up to joy and well-being. I think the key to remember is that just like in Zen, this practice isn't transactional. It's not like if I put in so many chants, then I'm going to get so much of this back. It's not about how many recitations, though we practice as much as we can because that's how we get better. But ultimately, it is being fully open and connected to the practice without any other thought distracting or drawing our attention away. So that's why we talk about the mind is affixed to the task, so that's the mindfulness. And then our heart is open and full like the Buddha. If we achieve that state, then we no longer fall into delusion. So this is, being fully invested in the practice. And I think all of you at some point have hovered or even crossed over into that space, even if it's for, a fleeting second. earlier in my practice, I would have these moments where I just felt like everything fell away. And it was kind of like I couldn't tell where my body and everything else separated. And that happened, and then my thought went, oh, am I having this awakening experience? And then all of a sudden, boom, I'm back in, my body's right there sitting in the room, and then when I would go and meditate again, and I'd start to feel that starting to happen. I'd go, oh, is it happening? And then boom, right back where I was, right? So it's hard to attain and stay with that, because that intellectual mind is so trained to analyze and check everything that we prevent ourselves from fully entering into that state. So that's why we practice as much as we can. After a while, that intellectual mind is just kind of like, oh, you're doing that thing. Okay, well, have fun with that, because it's boring. And that's really what we're trying to do, is to make that experience become just like every experience, no big deal. And some of you have come to me and said, I had this experience when I was practicing, and is that meditation? And my response is always, it's part of it, but don't make it special. Because as soon as you make it special, you're never going to get it again. Because now you're like trying to hold it with the intellect, and the intellect, well, can't hold that. It's beyond its capability. We also touch that when we're really engaged in something. I know people who are creative tend to experience this more often, but it can happen with anybody in anything that they do, where you are working on something, your concentration is so focused that you no longer are aware of what you're doing outside of the fact that you are aware that you're doing it. And then time kind of just goes away. And then when you kind of leave that state, that's when you look at the clock and you're like, 3 hours? I've been doing this for 3 hours? Because it felt like it was just happening. It's a little different than being mindless, because it's not like you're tuned out. It's you're very tuned in. So you're not aware of every action, but you're aware in a wholly concentrated way of what you're doing. I would find myself when I was doing my painting, where I would step away after that and see all the stuff I had painted that I had no independent awareness of doing, even though I knew I was doing it. And there was always those times where, it felt like 10 minutes and it was 3 hours. So we all touch that. And this is a practice that is trying to help us open up to that. And the last thing about this paragraph, and I think this is the most important thing, Pure Land Buddhism is a practice that helps prepare us for death. And it's something I think that our culture really, really needs. Because if we are dying and we are in the process of dying, we know that we're dying, having a practice where we can concentrate our mind on something to provide a sense of peace and support while our body is beginning to cease functioning, I think is probably one of the most helpful things that we can do. Having spent time with my grandmother when she was dying, and we talked a lot about what she was experiencing. We talked, she was very open to wondering, but also there was a lot of fear and anxiety. And she didn't practice Pure Land Buddhism, but she prayed a lot. And I think her talking about it helped a lot. But it got me thinking afterwards how if we had something where we could direct our mind to, so that we weren't spending all of our time trying so hard to understand everything, because we're not going to get to any kind of satisfactory truth in that process. Then we can embody a quality of peace and joy in the process that I think a lot of people don't experience in their lives today. A lot of people die with regrets. A lot of people die wishing they had spent more time addressing the question of their own mortality. So Pure Land, one of the benefits it has, I think, is that it gives us something that we can affix our mind to, so that we don't just hold on to the anxiety and fear, because that's going to be there. I mean, it would be unusual, I think, for someone to not have some level of fear and anxiety as they're dying. But it would be, I think, a relief and a solace to have something that we could just, even if it is visualizing, Amitabha or this beautiful place. Christians have these kind of ideas in relation to heaven and saying the Lord's Prayer, or the Virgin Mary or Jesus. These can also be very comforting, is the word I was thinking of. Yeah. And so I see that as something really beneficial in this Pure Land approach. Let's have someone who would like to read 8.
I can read it.
Okay, thank you.
I have seen this benefit, and so I speak these words. If sentient beings hear what I say, they must make a vow to be born in that land. Right now, I am extolling the benefits of the inconceivable merits of Amitabha Buddha. But in the eastern direction, there are also countless other Buddhas, like Akshobhya Buddha, and the Buddha Marks of the Polar Mountain, and the Buddha Great Polar Mountain, and the Buddha Light of the Polar Mountain, and the Buddha Wondrous Voice. Each of them preaches in his own land with the eloquence of a Buddha, and covers a whole cosmos, speaking the truth. All of you sentient beings should believe this scripture, extolling their inconceivable merits, and which all Buddhas protect and keep in mind. In the worlds of the southern direction, there are countless other Buddhas, like the Buddha Lamp of the Sun and Moon, and Buddha Light of Renown, and the Buddha Great Flaming Shoulders, and the Buddha Lamp of the Polar Mountain, and the Buddha Infinite Progress. Each of them preaches in his own land with the eloquence of a Buddha, and covers a whole cosmos, speaking the truth. All of you sentient beings should believe the scripture, extolling their inconceivable merits, and which all Buddhas protect and keep in mind. In the worlds of the western direction, there are countless other Buddhas, like the Buddha Infinite Life, and the Buddha Innumerable Characteristics, and the Buddha Innumerable Banners, and the Buddha Great Light, and the Buddha Great Illumination, and the Buddha Mark of Reality, and the Buddha Light of Purity. Each of them preaches in his own land with the eloquence of a Buddha, and covers a whole cosmos, speaking the truth. All of you sentient beings should believe this scripture, extolling their inconceivable merits, in which all Buddhas protect and keep in mind. In the worlds of the northern direction, there are countless other Buddhas, like the Buddha Flaming Shoulders, and the Buddha Supreme Voice, and the Buddha Unstoppable, and the Buddha Born of the Sun, and the Buddha Netted Light. Each of them preaches in his own, own land with the eloquence of a Buddha and covers a whole cosmos, speaking the truth. All of you sentient beings should believe this scripture, extolling their inconceivable merits, and which all Buddhas protect and keep in mind. In the worlds of the nadir, there are countless other Buddhas, like the Buddha Lion, and the Buddha Repute, and the Buddha Light, and the Buddha Dharma Banner, and the Buddha Upholding the Dharma. Each of them preaches in his own land with the eloquence of a Buddha and covers a whole cosmos, speaking the truth. All of you sentient beings should believe this scripture, extolling their inconceivable merits, in which all Buddhas protect and keep in mind. In the worlds of the zenith, there are countless other Buddhas, like the Buddha Pure Voice, and the Buddha Sojourner King, and the Buddha Incense Fragrance, and the Buddha Fragrance Light, and the Buddha Great Blazing Shoulders, and the Buddha Body of Multicolored Jewel Flower Garlands, and the Buddha Sala Tree King, and the Buddha Precious Flower Virtue, and the Buddha Sees All Truths, and the Buddha Like Polar Mountain. Each of them preaches in his own land with the eloquence of a Buddha and covers a whole cosmos, speaking the truth. All of you sentient beings should believe this scripture, extolling their inconceivable merits, which all Buddhas protect and keep in mind. Why do you think this is called the sutra that is protected and keep in mind by all the Buddhas? If there are good men and good women who hear this scripture, accept it and uphold it, and they hear the names of all these Buddhas, all these good men and good women will be protected and kept in mind by all these Buddhas, and all of them will reach the level where they do not turn back from complete, unexcelled, correct awakening. Therefore, all of you should faithfully accept what I say and what all the Buddhas have said. All those people who have vowed or are vowing or will vow to be born in the land of Amitabha Buddha reach the level where they do not turn back from complete unexcelled awakening, whether in their past lives, their present lives, or their future lives. Therefore, all good men and good women, if they have faith, must make a vow to be born in that land.
Aren't we so glad that Cleary translated the Buddhist names for us and not left
Wow.
them, in Sanskrit? Can you imagine going through that? So what this section, remember, for those of you from our first talk, remember, the Buddha started to talk about Amitabha Buddha because he was facing west. If he had been facing east, he would have listed off would have started teaching about one of those Buddhas that he talked about that were in the East. So really what this is just saying is that the Buddhas, when we talk about the Buddhas in the 10 directions, these are the 10 directions: East, West, South, North, their midpoint directions, and up and down. And so this is just another skillful means that says, you don't want to look at Amitabha Buddha as your guide. Then here are all these other Buddhas. You could choose one of them. That's really what this is describing. And of course, if we remember, one Buddha is all the Buddhas, so it doesn't really matter which one you pick. And maybe Shakyamuni Buddha is kind of saying, if they're all the same Buddhas, then why not just pick Amitabha Buddha if you need that one to go and reach toward? The other thing I think we want to keep in mind is that our practice is meant for us to understand the absolute world and the relative world together. Not, most of us are only aware of the relative world. Many of us have not been taught about the absolute world. But we can't only just live in the absolute world either, because we couldn't function in our lives if we only saw the absolute world. So what our practice is for us to learn how to kind of walk the line between the two, so that while we are operating in this relative world, we also understand the abstractness of the absolute. And that's how we can say that, I am also everyone else. And that's why we can also say that one Buddha is all the Buddhas, because the absolute world has no distinctions to separate things. The other element here that in the Pure Land context, and this is the one that also Westerners confuse and tend to use as a way to dismiss Pure Land practice, is this notion of faith. And the faith that we are looking at here is the faith that the Buddha is offering us here through his teachings, which is that if you follow the teachings and you have faith in the teachings, then you will realize the truth of what I'm saying. And so it wasn't having faith in the Buddha, it was having faith in what he taught that was important. And I think when we struggle with this notion of outside power, a lot of Christian and other Western faith traditions look at faith as an outside power. That if I affix myself to this outside power, then all I have to do is sit back and everything will happen for me. That is not what Buddhism teaches, because Buddhism is constantly telling us that we are the ones who make everything possible. Now, in Pure Land Buddhism, in the traditional sense, there may be an element of looking to that outside power as the transformative element. But when we understand the teachings more deeply, what we understand is that looking to that outside power is a tool. It is a tool like our chanting, or a tool like our sitting meditation, to help us embody the teachings. And when I was looking up some temples and places that are Pure Land, they practice just the Pure Land Buddhism, and almost all of them have programs that they it's either you enroll in courses, or they're like a weekly events or things where they teach about the Four Noble Truths, the Eightfold Path, the precepts, all of these things which are integral to how we practice. So I found that interesting, because the impression that I got early on when I was learning about Pure Land, or I wouldn't say learning, I had learned that there was this practice, and then I would get all of this sort of, oh, that's just, old superstitious stuff. People didn't realize that the practice is the chanting and the recitation, but there is also application of the teachings of the Buddha in your life. So it's not just recite the name over and over and over, and then I don't have to worry about anything, and everything's gonna just, be fine. There's still the active participation in what the Buddha taught, in how we conduct our lives, how we embody the 6 paramitas, and adopt, or how do I want to say this? Come to know each of the Eightfold Path elements, and how do we make them become alive in us, in our lives right now. So with Pure Land, faith is an important aspect, but faith is in the path, not in the being or the magical powers or the wish fulfillment. There are 2 other elements that come with Pure Land practice, and that's the aspiration. You have to have the aspiration to practice. Have any of you ever tried to do something you don't want to do? Pretty hard to do it, right? So cultivating the aspiration to practice, having faith in the path of practice, and then the third element is the practice itself, which is the diligence in learning the teachings of the Buddha. So those are the 3 elements in Pure Land practice that are important. And they, I think, are reflections of the Zen 3 pillars, which is faith, effort, and great doubt. I think in the case where effort is practice, faith is the same, the aspiration becomes the great doubt for Zen. And for Zen, that question of doubt is not that we doubt, we don't like have the faith in the practice and then doubt the practice. What we do, doubt means that we are willing to ask questions. How am I engaging with this? What am I experiencing through this practice? The ability to question, so that we are constantly being opened by the practice, not continually boxing us into the practice. I think that's the one element that kind of is unique to Zen in Buddhist practice, because Zen is ultimately trying to break us free from as many of the conditions and concepts that we've been indoctrinated into. So in order to do that, we have to question. We have, what is this belief that's popping in my head? What is this this sensation I'm feeling in my chest as I encounter the situation? That's the kind of doubt that Zen is encouraging us to cultivate. So you can see how the 2 practices can actually be supportive of each other in those ways. And then if we remember that Sukhavati is not a far off place, but if we practice skillfully, if we follow the Buddha's guidance, if we have faith in the practice, then we awaken to Sukhavati right this moment. And that the Saha world transforms into Sukhavati. So again, this sutra is just trying to encourage us to just dive in fully, and if we fully accept, as the Buddha says, then you will experience the truth of what he's saying. I think what's interesting was it Anne or Mary, I can't remember, asked about the Saha world. Or was it Yumio? I can't remember But if we understand that Sukhavati exists right here in the Saha world, what we experience is the sacred and the profane actually coexist. And so if we think of profane being living beings that are caught in the worldly cycle of birth and death, and all of the habit energies that are cultivated in being caught by that, then we can think of the sacred as the uh, the the liberated beings who are capable of caring for the profane without being overwhelmed by it. So this is the question of, how does the bodhisattva, how do we help the suffering without becoming the suffering? And that is because if we live in the Sukhavati world, which is also in the Saha world, we can still be helping those caught in the Saha world without falling back into the Saha world. And that is the other element here that's important in the earlier paragraphs of the sutra, which says, that once you arrive in Sukhavati, you don't regress. It's sort of like you can't unknow what you know now. Once you've arrived, you can't unknow that. It's kind of hard to unawaken yourself, even if it's a little moment of awakening. And then always remember that thread through this whole sutra is also the element of the Saha. I'm sorry, the Sangha. I forgot the other consonants. The Sangha is also our Sukhavati in our own life. So you think of the Sangha as the smaller form of Sukhavati. The whole worldly experience transforming is Sukhavati. And so all of what we are thinking about cultivating is also applied to cultivating the Sangha. And our practice is what helps strengthen that. Okay, last two paragraphs. Who would like to read 9? Jane, great, thank you.
Okay. Just as I am now extolling the inconceivable merits of the Buddhas, all those Buddhas are likewise extolling my inconceivable merits with these words. Shakyamuni Buddha is able to carry out a most difficult and rare task. In the world, endurance, this world, in an evil world of the 5 corruptions, the corruption of the age, the corruption of views, the corruption of afflictions, the corruption of sentient beings, and the corruption of life, he is able to achieve complete, unexcelled awakening, and to expound the truth which all beings in the 5 worlds find hard to believe. Know then that in the midst of this evil world of the 5 corruptions, I am able to carry out this difficult task, attain complete, unexcelled awakening, and expound the truth which is so hard to believe for beings in all worlds. This is indeed most difficult.
So what is being described here are a bunch of other teachings that the Buddha has given prior to this, primarily the 5 corruptions. One note too, that part of it says in the world endurance. That's what back in Buddha's time they called Earth. This planet was called endurance. They didn't call it Earth. And it was named endurance because it meant to exist on this planet, you had to endure all kinds of miseries. And so it just became, this world of endurance. then, you know, the Westerners just sort of like, you know, we're going to just call it Earth because that's what it's made of. Real creative, you know. You know, and then the sun was the sun. That was like, for me as a kid, that was like one of the most disappointing things, you know. It's like the sun is the sun because that's what it is. It didn't have like a name. It's just the sun, the moon. All the other planets have these cool names, right, for their moons. We just got moon. So one of the things here that's being taught is, again, this idea that the Buddha taught different ways. And one of the things that Shakyamuni Buddha was known for was the accomplishment of two things that no other teacher or previous you know, liberated being had been able to do. That was, one, he was able to awaken and teach others in the Saha world. And that and also he was a master of upaya, which means he had this ability to teach Dharma doors that were very difficult for others to believe. And so he had, you know, and there's like all these stories of the Buddha, you know, there's stories about when his cousin Devadatta tried to, or it was a stepbrother, I'm sorry, tried to have him assassinated. He sent assassins in to kill the Buddha, and every time he'd send an assassin in, the assassin would come out one of the Buddha's devotees. And, you know, there was a story of a serial killer, Anagolima, who the Buddha rushed out to, and the killer was going to kill the Buddha, and then the Buddha starts teaching him, and then he becomes his disciple. So he has this amazing ability to teach the Dharma, and people awaken. That's what we, you know, all of the Shravaka assembly, you hear that sometimes. The Shravaka assembly were all of the first hearers of the Buddha, the actual people who heard literally the teaching of the Buddha and were awakened. There can be no more Shravaka disciples because the Buddha is not here anymore. And so those were the two things that the Buddha was really known for. And this teaching of Amitabha Buddha is considered a difficult teaching because it's he's telling you about this place and to believe in it, and it's hard to believe in it at first because it sounds so fantastic. This was also something, if you read the Lotus Sutra, that you kind of experience these kind of weird, you know, sort of supernatural, or I thought, you know, maybe they just had a little bit too much opium or something, and, you know, had this weird thing with temples coming out of the ground and lotuses filling the sky. But these were all different Dharma doors that the Buddha used to teach. And he could teach easy doors, and he could also teach difficult doors, and he would reach many people that way. So that's kind of what this is talking about. And I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but I just want to describe quickly what the corruptions are. So we've got the corruption of the age, that's also corruption of time. The corruption of views, the corruption of afflictions is also what we would consider the corruption of mental states, unwholesome mental states. The corruption of sentient beings and the corruption of life or lifespan. So those things exist in the Saha world. When you awaken to Sukhavati, those 5 corruptions transform into the 5 purities. So the corruption of time becomes the corruption or the purity of security. So you think time, if we hold on to time, we are instantly subject to suffering, because then that means that time ends, right? There's a beginning and there's an end. If we let go of the construct of time, we gain security, because everything endures. There's no end if there's no time. The corruption of views is what we would talk about in the Eightfold Path as having uh, skillful views, or what they usually say is right view, but I like to say skillful view. And that is just simply understanding how to perceive the world without delusion or what am I? Distorted
Conditioning?
views. What were you gonna say?
I was going to say without conditioning.
Yeah, right. Without distortion. Yeah. And unwholesome mental states become wholesome mental states. Unwholesome mental states are, craving, anger, ignorance, arrogance, pride, all of the things that come from a mind that is caught by the ego. So then the wholesome mental formations transform in Sukhavati into generosity, equanimity, compassion, humility, all of those qualities. Interesting, why would living beings or sentient beings be considered a corruption? And again, those would be sentient beings who are conducting themselves in unwholesome things, like being unmindful, oppressing others, controlling others, manipulating others, being disloyal, acting unkindly or unjustly, all of those things. And so if we transform unwholesome, if we transform sentient beings, we become in the pure state at oneness with all things. So we no longer, all of the unwholesome behaviors are because we are believing that there's a separate self that we must act against others. But when we enter a pure state, we realize that there is no separation. And so I am as others are. And so we treat each other as one. And then the last one, and this goes back to the beginning of the sutra with Amitabha being of infinite lifespan. If you are caught in the Saha world, then the corruption is being caught in the cycle of birth and death, a lifespan. If you transport yourself to Sukhavati, then you understand that your body may be born and your body dies, but you have never been born and you will never die. The Saha world is where we're caught by our bodies and we believe only in the life of our body, and forget that we are not just our bodies. So I'm going to read the last paragraph and then we will explore some questions. So when Buddha had finished preaching the scripture, Shariputra and all the monks and all the other gods and humans and asuras and the rest who had been listening, having heard what the Buddha said, rejoiced and faithfully accepted it. They all bowed in homage and departed. So there is always, the ending paragraph that just sort of describes those who are present and, usually being either transformed or somehow appreciative of the teaching. And that then, sort of ends the presentation, as it were. So that's the shorter Amitabha Buddha. Any questions that have been popping up in your mind as we've described, kind of explored this?
Can we go back to the very first paragraph, like when they, with the
Oh, uh-huh.
structure of a sutra is that it always says what the main meaning is in the beginning?
Well, yes, but usually it's not that it describes what the meaning is, it depicts what the teaching is. Because, we know from our practice that the best teacher is just doing practice, right? So this is where the Buddha, after the introduction, and says who's there, then the Buddha says, at the time, Buddha said to the elder Shariputra, west of here, past 100 billion Buddha lands, there exists a world called ultimate bliss. In this land, there exists a Buddha called Amitabha, who is expounding the Dharma right now. So that's telling us right there that from this point on, everything that's being described is about Amitabha is the Buddha. Because if we understand that all Buddhas are the same Buddha, then Amitabha, who is expounding the Dharma right now, is the Buddha who is expounding the Dharma right now. Is that what you were questioning?
Yes, thank you.
In other sutras, like the Diamond Sutra, it's even more explicit in his teaching. That first paragraph, or maybe like the second one, is after the introduction. It describes the Buddha walking around his seating place after having washed his feet in his bowls, and then sits and assembles his robe accordingly, and then begins to teach. And that right there, that describing of what was going on, was the teaching that then the rest of the Diamond Sutra is explaining.
Yeah.
And all of the sutras are like that, because the Buddha, he's always telling us about letting go of all these concepts and things, right? But because we live in the relative world, and because a lot of us haven't fully understood the shunyata, the absolute and the relative relationships, then we have to use all of these teachings to help us understand that. So all of this sutra following that paragraph is just a way to describe stuff for those of us who still need concepts to guide us. That's why he was considered, a remarkable Buddha, because he could teach people in the Saha world how to leave the Saha world while he was in the Saha world. That's like, and all of the other sort of depictions of people awakening, it would be like a god would come from the clouds and their booming voice would say something, and then the person would be motivated to change. And the Buddha didn't do that. The Buddha didn't have to call a god down and get everybody to understand. He would just say the teaching, and then everybody, I think it's kind of funny, because you think, like when he did the fire sermon, there were like 1,500 Brahmin priests at this sermon that he gave, and then like half of them became disciples after he gave the teaching. And just imagine, you got all these priests of this other religion who go to hear this Buddha talk about stuff, and in the speech he's talking about how wrong these priests are, and he's so convincing that the majority of them end up abandoning their. I mean, we're talking like they're the highest level of caste in the society, and they dropped it all and followed the Buddha after that. That's, you know, a remarkable skill.
What was that teaching?
It's called the fire sermon. Um, and that's like colloquial term. I don't remember exactly which sutra it's in. It's one of his earlier ones. It's after, you know, we taught the turning of the wheel of the Dharma. It's certainly much before this one. But it's usually, if you look up fire sermon, you'll get the part where he teaches. It's about how everything's on fire, the world's on fire. And he was using that language because he was talking to Brahmins, who are the fire tenders. They are the ones who, you know, created these fires that they would give offerings to Brahma. And so that's why he used this whole fire analogy. This is why he was so good at what he did, because he was able to use skillful means to get his teaching across to the right people. And then he would go to a different group of people and he would offer a different teaching. He's teaching the same thing all this time, but he's just using different ways to convey it to reach the people that he's sitting in front of. Just like here, you know, this is one of the few teachings that someone doesn't ask him a question. Usually someone asks him a question and then he goes into this teaching. This is one where he sees who's assembled before him and is inspired by who he's seeing to give this teaching about this place, Sukhavati, which means that he must have assessed from the gathering of people that these were people who were struggling with needing this idea of something to reach for. And that's why, you know, we have bodhisattvas depicted on our altar and Buddhas depicted on our altar, not because we think they are gods or, you know, the objects themselves are alive and we you know, supplicant to them. They're just tools that we use to help us envision these qualities we're trying to cultivate in ourselves in a way that makes it easier to picture. And so this is really what this teaching is offering, is, you know, if I just picture this place where everything is beautiful and everyone is helpful and everyone is trying to just get everybody to be better, then I can work with that. And if I can picture that in my mind as I'm practicing, it's pretty likely that then I'll start making that appear right where I am. Because as we grow in our practice, we start to understand that, you know, our mind is really what makes this the Saha world.
So about Sukhavati. So I have in my notes from the first Dharma talk you gave. I have here, it's where you go, where you're born after death. Everything is conducive to reaching peri-nirvana. So what you're saying then is that you don't have to actually die, that you can still be in this world and have Sukhavati. So is it a state of mind more than a place that you go to after?
Yeah, the traditional practice is that you just cultivate this, and then you know, you got to think of back when this was being really developed in China. People couldn't. There were a whole vast numbers of people who couldn't go to temples, who had to work in the fields, you know, day after day. And so they couldn't devote the kind of time to the temple, offering to the monks and everything, to collect the merit so that they would be able to have a better rebirth. So what they did was the Mahayanas introduced this teaching so that while they're working in the fields, they could be chanting Amitabha Buddha, and wherever they are doing anything, they can just chant that and really just focus and practice fully in what they're doing as a way to cultivate that merit. And then what the added appeal was that don't worry if you can't awaken in this life. You can die as long as you've cultivated all this in this world that is all conducive to teaching you to awaken. And that was a relief for people who, because they were at this time competing with Zen teachers who were kind of promoting this whole idea that you're going to awaken any moment if you just endure your meditation long enough, or things like that. So that's the traditional approach. The contemporary, the more modern approach is that Sukhavati exists here and now, and it's just a matter of changing your mind and how you perceive the world, and that change comes through the practice.
Thank you.
So the last thing I just wanted to offer is, what is the chanting practice? What is the recollection? And for those of us on Sunday, we do it every time we do Namo Amitabha Buddha, Namo Amitabha Buddha, Namo Amitabha Buddha. And there are different rhythms, different, and if you hear Chinese people, they're going to say Namo Ami Tofu, which always makes me hungry. But it's just the Chinese pronunciation as Ami Tofu. It's not really tofu, but it sounds kind of like tofu. And the other recitations that we do on Sunday, the Namo, what is it? Just had it. What is it? Namo Tassa.
Bhagavato Arahato Sama Sambuddhasa.
Yes. But the early recitation or giving homage to the Buddha, that's also, we can use that as a recollection of the Buddha practice. The idea is, just like when we're doing any of our other chanting or meditation practices, is to concentrate our mind on the practice while also opening our heart to compassion and love. And if we are able to do that without reservation, without our mind trying to tell us, oh, you shouldn't, oh, this is silly or whatever, or I'm not doing it good enough, or any of those kind of things, then we are awakening to Sukhavati right here, right now. And then it's also simultaneously why practicing with a Sangha is so important too, because when the Sangha comes together, then we are living in Sukhavati. The Sangha is like Amitabha's land. And all of the other Sangha members are the Bodhisattvas and other Buddhas and other living beings coming here to teach us. It's like a... Goodness. Not Sukhavati up there.
Please inject yourself.
So the visualization is another technique, and there's a whole long process. And that's what the longer Sukhavati Sutra or the longer Amitabha Sutra is about, is the different steps that one goes through to visualize the Buddha. And you do it as a practice that can take, a long time to cultivate. So, and it's usually starts with depicting the setting sun, the red circle of the sun and the light around it. And then you start adding in elements of the Buddha in that vision work. And just like with meditation, it's, the mind is fixed on the practice, and the heart is opening to the love. And as you make, more and more of your attention is fixed to that practice, then Sukhavati is realized right here and now. And at some point, I'll do a teaching on the basic elements of the visualization. And then the thing to keep in mind here is that if we understand that outside power, inside power are, not separate, not two different things, then we don't have to be limited by just Amitabha Buddha. And that's what this teaching is also showing us, is, when Mio read the verse with all the directions. There are countless other, ways we can visualize and incorporate the practice. And so that's why, Thich Nhat Hanh talks about, other faith traditions are Pure Land practice when they talk about thinking of, heaven on earth, or, opening your heart to Jesus, or all these other, having Allah, enter your heart. All of these things are Pure Land style techniques. And I got really, swept into this rabbit hole that I'm not going to, go on a tangent on, but just to say that there's this whole notion that the early Mahayana Pure Land practices are actually what inspired Jesus to preach what he did in the New Testament. And when you think about, there's so many parallels to what Jesus taught in the New Testament to the Mahayana Buddhist tradition, that it doesn't seem like a stretch to imagine that, when he was gone for 30 or 40 years, whatever it was, that he could very well have been in the East learning from Buddhists. So I think, as we continue to develop our own practice, as Lotus Heart continues to reach out to other people, this is just another element of our practice that allows us to be accommodating to other techniques of practice that aren't contrary to what we practice as Zen practitioners, but also, I think, in some ways can enhance our practice. It certainly, it enriches us, and it widens our ability to accommodate different practitioners in the Sangha without feeling like it's a mishmash, I guess you could say. And I'm really pleased that you all have, joined in and participated and took the time to listen, because I think that as we go forward in our own practice, having techniques like this in our tool belt is going to be really beneficial, because our society is going through a lot of change, and it's the kind of change that is not comfortable. And even though in some ways it's a lot of uh, decaying and breaking down. It's the kind of breaking down that, as a practiced Buddhist, sees as a positive, because only the good stuff grows out of the rotten stuff. And but you got to break it down. You can't plant a tomato on a on a compost that hasn't composted. And so we are kind of seeing the compost being made. And if we understand that our lives are going to get more challenging, then we don't have to get too upset about not being able to spend many days at a retreat or hours sitting in a meditation, that we can accommodate our practice however our life is manifesting. So like Mio, when you had to extend your commuting time, being able to do the chanting during your driving ended up giving you more practice time than before when you were just doing sitting in the morning.
Yeah, that was really cool.
So this, I'm hoping, is a way for us to be more flexible about our practice. I think Westerners in particular, in relation to adopting Buddhist practice, tend to get very rigid about it's just this way, and that doesn't help you when life says well, it's going to be this way, and you're saying no, but it's got to be this way. And the Buddha didn't tell us to not meet life as it appeared. He said the opposite, right? That meet life as it appears. But we don't have to spend all this time and energy trying to transform the reality that we have in front of us. All we have to do is transform our own mind, and then we are at home right where we are. And so this is one of these practices that I hope we get to explore some more as Lotus Heart Zen, and also individually on your own. And then I'm working on another talk. It's not going to happen in the immediate future because it's kind of hard to read and take care of a 3-year-old.
What?
I know.
What? Are you really?
I think it's a failing on my part, but
No, it's
he doesn't want to. He doesn't want to sit and read books on the Hawaiian Buddhism.
What? I'm so surprised.
Yes.
But once I get through some of that, because that's the third element of our lineage. It's the Zen, Pure Land, and then Hawaiian Buddhism, which is the mind-only school. And just a succinct element of it is that our mind makes everything. So, which to me makes, the three together makes a whole lot of sense. And so that'll be my next sort of series of talks to kind of go over that. So then we have these three practices that form the base or the foundation of our, practice through Lotus Heart Zen, which ultimately means that we're more open and flexible to all of us coming together and being able to practice in the ways that we connect with. So any questions? Any last thoughts?
Well, thank you very much for doing this.
Well, thank you for letting me do it. I could have, done the first talk and then next week opened up and nobody's there. Then that's when I'd be like, well, I'm just going to do my teaching and then hope maybe somebody's going to watch later. But I didn't have to do that, so thank you.
And happy birthday, Jane.
Yes.
Happy
And
birthday,
James.
Jane. Happy
On
birthday,
both
Jane.
Jane and James.
Jane.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And happy birthday, James, too.
Well,
Yeah.
I'm going to compile all of the birthdays that happen while we're in our isolation. And then when we get together next, we'll have a big Buddha's birthday with
Ooh.
lots of cake. And then we'll have also James and Jane's and anybody else's birthday we missed while we were separate.
Well, I think we should have ice cream and cake on Friday night.
I'm having popcorn. I don't know what you guys are doing.
Oh, for the movie. Yeah.
Yeah.
For the movie and for Jane's birthday.
Oh, that too.
I was thinking wine, but okay.
Yeah, this is great. Then you have to worry about driving home.
Oh, nice.
Any other
So I'm
thoughts?
still on call, so no wine either.
Aw.
I know.
You have any last thoughts here?
Oh, Tessie.
Just, I need to be in your lap right now. Well, thank you all.
Thank you.
And
Thank you.
Thank you.
hopefully some of you can make it to the film on Friday. And, or tomorrow I've got another meditation teaching. So see you all soon.
Good
Yes.
night.
Take
Have a good
care,
night.
everyone. Good
Thank
See you
night.
soon. Good to see everyone.